On December 3, 1891, a 24-year-old woman named May said yes to a prince. He was second in line to the British throne. The wedding was set for February. 6 weeks later, he was dead. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, died on January 14, 1892. Pneumonia tangled up with the influenza pandemic, tearing through Britain that winter. Gone in days. And May, who'd been weeks away from becoming a future queen, was suddenly just a girl in a black dress with nowhere particular to go. But here's the part that still stops people cold, more than a century later. Within 18 months, she was engaged again, to his younger brother, George. She always did her duty. That's the line everyone reaches for when they talk about Mary of Teck. Duty. Always duty. And it's true, she did. From the moment she accepted that second proposal to the day she died 60 years later, she never once wavered from what she believed the crown required of her. But her own bodyguard? He had very different words for the woman behind the crown. Words that, when biographer James Pope Hennessy went digging through private household accounts decades later, painted a portrait that didn't quite match the official one. As sour as she looked, was how one member of her household put it. Not for publication. Not for the record. Just the truth as they saw it, spoken quietly to a man with a notebook. So which was she? The saint of duty, or the terror behind closed doors? Both. And the proof lives in a place that's been hiding in plain sight this entire time: the jewels. She was born Victoria Mary Augusta, Louise Olga, Pauline Claudine Agnes on May 26, 1867, at Kensington Palace in London. Her family called her May, after her birth month. 7 names for a baby girl, which sounds grand until you look at the family's actual situation. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, was a genuine granddaughter of King George III. Real royal blood, no question. But her father, Francis, Duke of Teck, carried a problem in his pedigree. His own mother, Countess Claudine Redet, hadn't been of equal royal rank when she married into the Württemberg family. In the rigid hierarchy of European royalty, this made the Tecks something awkward. Royal enough to live in Kensington Palace, not quite royal enough to be treated as equals by the grandest courts. Francis held the title of Serene Highness instead of Royal Highness. The difference sounds absurd. It wasn't. It determined where you sat at dinner, whom you could marry, and whether anyone took your family seriously. And then there was the money. Or rather, the absence of it. May's mother spent like a princess without the income to match. Generous to a fault, physically imposing, warm-hearted, and completely incapable of living within her means. By 1883, the debts had gotten so unmanageable that the Tecks essentially fled the country. They retreated to Florence, Italy. Cheaper rents, fewer creditors knocking. May was 16. Old enough to understand exactly what was happening. The family settled among the expatriate communities that clustered around the Tuscan capital, living in rented accommodations while their debts in England slowly cooled. For roughly 2 years, from 1883 to 1885, May inhabited a strange limbo. Technically a princess, practically a refugee from her own family's financial recklessness. She watched her father, the Duke of Teck, struggle with the humiliation of it, a man whose royal title meant less every month they stayed away. She watched her mother continue to be generous and sociable, and oblivious to the reality that generosity was precisely what had landed them here. And she absorbed a lesson that would take years to fully articulate, but only seconds to feel. This is what happens when people with position don't protect it. Florence gave her something else, though. Surrounded by Renaissance architecture, by churches dripping with gold leaf, and museums she could visit for free, May developed the sharp, almost scholarly eye that would define her for the rest of her life. She learned to look at beautiful objects not just with admiration, but with understanding. Provenance, craftsmanship, Historical context. She wasn't a tourist gaping at pretty things. She was training herself, though she couldn't have known it yet, for a lifetime of acquisition and preservation. The 16-year-old girl in that rented Florentine villa was becoming the woman who would one day reassemble scattered royal gemstones across decades with the patience of a medieval stonemason building a cathedral. The family returned to England eventually, but the lesson never left her. Position was fragile. Status could vanish. The distance between a palace and exile was terrifyingly short. So when Queen Victoria identified May as the ideal bride for Prince Albert Victor in 1891, it wasn't just a marriage proposal. It was a lifeline, a path from the edges of royalty to its absolute center. Albert Victor himself wasn't universally admired. Rumors had trailed him for years. Whispers about the Cleveland Street scandal of 1889, a raid on a male brothel that implicated several aristocrats, plus a broader reputation for being intellectually underwhelming and temperamentally unsuited for kingship. None of that was May's concern. She'd been offered a role, and she accepted it, the way she'd accept everything that followed, with composed, unflinching obligation. Then he died, January 14th, 1892. And Queen Victoria, who'd watched May carefully during the engagement, made a calculation that was ice-cold in its pragmatism and arguably brilliant in its foresight. This young woman was too valuable to lose from the succession. The surviving brother George, steadier, more dependable, less dazzling, was the new heir. He needed a wife. Victoria saw the obvious solution. George proposed to May on May 3, 1893, at Sheen Lodge in Richmond. They married on July 6th at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace, 17 months after his brother's funeral. Did anyone ask May what she wanted? The record doesn't really suggest so. The match was presented as the natural, proper course of events, and she accepted it with the same composure that would define everything she did for the next 6 decades. Whether she'd loved Albert Victor or merely accepted him, she never publicly said. What she showed, through 60 years of conduct, was that once she took on a role, she inhabited it completely. The girl called May essentially disappeared. In her place, Queen Mary. That arranged marriage, though, it actually worked. Not in any fairy tale way. George V wasn't built for grand romantic gestures. He loved his stamp collection, his shooting, the predictable rhythms of royal life. But his diaries reveal something disarming. He once wrote that he feared he loved Mary more than she loved him. From a man not known for introspection, that admission carries real weight. Mary was the sharper mind of the two, better read, more culturally curious, a stronger political thinker. She gave him confidence. He gave her the unquestioned legitimacy she'd craved since childhood. Multiple courtiers noted he was visibly calmer when she was in the room, and that Mary's rare moments of visible softness were almost always directed at him. It was partnership, not passion, and it lasted. During the First World War, Mary threw herself into the home front, hospital visits, clothing drives, public morale, and stood beside George in 1917 when the family dropped the German name Saxe-Coburg-Gotha and became the House of Windsor. Mary understood, maybe better than George did, that wartime survival meant being seen as unimpeachably British. December 1936 cut deeper because it was personal. Her eldest son David, Edward VIII, abdicated to marry Wallace Simpson. Mary was furious in a way that went beyond ordinary disappointment. She reportedly told him she couldn't understand how he could have descended to such depths. She never received Wallace, never softened, never wavered in her conviction that what David had done wasn't romantic. It was a dereliction. The breach never healed, and Mary carried it like a wound for the remaining 17 years of her life, a private fury burning behind that immaculate public composure. The most significant, most enduring, most physically dazzling thing Mary built has been sitting in plain sight this entire time. The jewelry. Not trinkets, not costume pieces. The actual crown jewels of the British monarchy as they exist today. Mary didn't just inherit a collection. She built one, systematically, obsessively, over decades. She consolidated scattered family stones, commissioned new settings, purchased gems from European royals whose empires had collapsed underneath them, and transformed what had been a somewhat haphazard assortment into the coherent, spectacular collection the world now recognizes. If you've ever watched a British queen or princess wear a tiara and felt that jolt of recognition, you're almost certainly looking at Mary's work. Start with the Cambridge emeralds, because they tell you everything about how she operated. These stones originally belonged to her grandmother, Princess Augusta, Duchess of Cambridge, who had acquired them in the early 19th century. When Augusta died in 1889, the emeralds scattered through the family, some to Mary's mother, the Duchess of Teck, and some to Mary's aunt, Augusta, Grand Duchess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Mary's mother died in 1897, and that's when the campaign began. Over years, Mary corresponded with relatives, negotiated, and quietly gathered those emeralds back into a single collection. Stone by stone, letter by letter. With the patience of someone who understood that permanence is built slowly. Then she put them to work. She had them set into the Delhi Durbar necklace, a breathtaking Gerard creation that draped emeralds and diamonds across the chest in cascading rows. Later, she pulled them from the Durbar tiara and reset them into a smaller, more wearable piece. Because Mary was never sentimental about a setting when a better arrangement existed. She cared about the stones and what they represented. The settings were just vehicles. Those Cambridge emeralds, reassembled through decades of patience, went to Elizabeth II and remain in the working royal collection right now. The Cullinan diamonds operate on a scale that borders on absurd. The Cullinan, discovered in South Africa's premier mine in 1905, was the largest gem-quality rough diamond ever found. 3,106 carats in its uncut state, roughly the size of a man's fist. The Transvaal government presented it to King Edward VII, who had it cut by the Asher firm in Amsterdam into 9 major stones and dozens of smaller brilliants. The 2 biggest went into the sovereign's scepter and the imperial state crown, where they sit today. But the 3rd and 4th largest? Cullinan III, a 94.4 carat pear-shaped diamond, and Cullinan IV, a 63.6 carat cushion cut, were set into a brooch for Queen Mary. She wore them together, one dangling from the other, and the royal family nicknamed them Granny's chips. Let that land for a second. 2 of the largest polished diamonds on Earth, and she pinned them to her coat, like a particularly nice cameo. Cullinan V, an 18.8 carat heart-shaped brilliant, became yet another brooch, which could also be fitted into a platinum and diamond circlet she wore as a headband. Stones 6 through 9 were set into still more brooches and pendants she wore, lent, and passed down. Elizabeth II inherited every one and wore the Cullinan brooches throughout her 70-year reign. When you saw the late Queen with those unmistakable twin diamonds on her left shoulder, that was Mary's taste, Mary's arrangement, Mary's decision about how those extraordinary stones should meet the world. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland. Tiara was a wedding gift to Mary in 1893, purchased by a committee of young women from across the British Isles and made by Gerard in a festoon and scroll design set with diamonds. Mary treasured it for decades before giving it to the then Princess Elizabeth as a wedding present in 1947. Elizabeth wore it so constantly, official portraits, banknotes, state events, that it became Granny's tiara. For millions of people worldwide, it is the tiara, the default image when you think diamond crown. And it started as a wedding gift to a woman from the wrong side of the royal tracks. The Vladimir tiara has an origin story that reads like a spy novel. It belonged to Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna of Russia, Grand Duchess Vladimir, one of the wealthiest women in pre-revolutionary St. Petersburg. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, the tiara was locked inside the Vladimir Palace. Its rescue was a genuine covert operation. Albert Stopford, a well-connected British antiquarian, entered Petrograd with the assistance of contacts at the British Embassy. This was a semi-diplomatic affair, not a lone adventure. Found the jewels in a concealed safe, packed them into a battered Gladstone bag, and smuggled them out through diplomatic channels. Grand Duchess Vladimir died in exile in 1920. Her heirs sold the tiara. Mary bought it in 1921, and then, in a move that was pure Mary, she commissioned interchangeable Cambridge emerald drops so she could swap out the original pearl pendants. Pearls one day, emeralds the next. She didn't just buy a beautiful object. She integrated it into her existing collection with the precision of an archivist, cross-referencing files. Elizabeth II inherited the Vladimir tiara and wore it in both configurations for decades. It remains one of the most photographed tiaras in existence. The Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara, commissioned from Gerard in 1914, based on a design that had belonged to her grandmother, Princess Augusta. The original had been broken up, but Mary had it recreated. 19 pearl drops suspended within diamond lover's knot bows on a diamond band. Gorgeous and famously heavy. Diana reportedly complained it gave her headaches. Catherine, Princess of Wales, wears it now to state banquets. Every time it catches a flashbulb, Mary's commission, Mary's vision, still dazzling over a century later. Mary's fringe tiara, crafted by Gerard in 1919, from a diamond necklace Queen Victoria had given as a wedding gift, radiates vertical diamond rays upward like a sunburst. Clean, geometric, almost Art Deco in feeling. Mary lent it to Princess Elizabeth for her wedding on November 20th, 1947. It snapped on the morning of the ceremony and had to be rushed to the crown jeweler for emergency repair. The kind of detail that reminds you these aren't museum pieces behind glass. Princess Anne wore it at her wedding in 1973, Princess Beatrice in 2020. One tiara, one commission, threading through 3 generations of royal brides. And then the Cartier diamond bandeau she acquired in 1932, a flexible strip of diamonds in platinum with a detachable center brooch. It sat in the vaults for decades, nearly forgotten, until May 2018, when Meghan Markle wore it at her wedding to Prince Harry. A piece Mary selected nearly 90 years earlier, suddenly the most talked-about jewel on earth. What separated Mary from any wealthy person who simply buys expensive things was her systematic intelligence. She researched provenance obsessively. She knew which stones had belonged to which branch of which royal house. She tracked pieces that had been sold, broken up, or scattered. And when European monarchies collapsed after the First World War and the Russian Revolution, she was positioned, financially, intellectually, and socially, to catch pieces before they disappeared into private hands forever. She understood that these objects carried historical weight far beyond their carat value, and she saw preserving them as part of her duty to the crown. She also navigated the legal distinction between her personal property and official crown jewels with real sophistication, ensuring key pieces were classified in ways that would keep them within the royal family in perpetuity. She wasn't just collecting, she was building infrastructure. There it is again, that word, duty. Even the diamonds came back to duty. Mary's reputation as a collector did carry a shadow, and it'd be dishonest to ignore it. The stories are well known. She'd visit someone's home, admire a particular object with such pointed, sustained enthusiasm that the host felt compelled to offer it as a gift. Her household apparently became accustomed to this pattern. Some accounts suggest her staff would quietly warn hosts in advance. Whether the behavior was compulsive, a form of calculated royal prerogative, or gossip inflated through decades of retelling, the historical consensus leans towards some combination of all three. Most accounts focus on art objects and decorative pieces, but her relentless consolidation of the Cambridge emeralds, the years of correspondence, the patient negotiations with family members who may not have wanted to part with their share, carried that same energy. Perfectly legal, every bit of it, but exhausting to be on the other side of. The result is the most significant royal jewelry collection in the world, and none of it vanished into a private vault. It's worn, it's seen, it's public. That doesn't erase the discomfort some people felt, but it complicates the easy narrative. When James Pope Hennessy conducted interviews for Mary's official biography, published in 1959, 6 years after her death, the resulting book was diplomatic, carefully worded, appropriate. His private notes were something else entirely. Staff members, courtiers, people who'd served in her household for years, spoke with a candor they never would have shown publicly. And what emerged was a portrait of someone considerably more complicated than the serene figurehead the nation had mourned. As sour as she looked wasn't one person's opinion. It was a thread running through multiple accounts, a pattern, not an outlier. Mary could be imperious, cold, exacting in a way that left little room for human error. She expected perfection from her household and offered very little warmth in return. Staff didn't describe a tyrant. That would have been simpler to process. They described something harder to pin down. A woman who maintained such rigid control over every interaction that genuine human connection became nearly impossible. The formality wasn't reserved for public occasions. It was constant, exhausting, unrelenting. Her children felt it most acutely, and this is where the story turns genuinely painful. The emotional distance between Mary and her sons wasn't the benign neglect common among aristocratic parents, who simply handed children off to nannies. It was something more active, a stiffness, a withholding of approval and physical affection that her children carried with them into adulthood. Their youngest son, Prince John, makes this hardest to look at. John was epileptic and likely autistic, and as his condition became more apparent, he was quietly moved to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate in 1917, cared for by his nanny Charlotte "Lala" Bill, separated from the rest of the family. He lived there, largely out of sight, until his death from a severe seizure on January 18, 1919. He was 13 years old. Mary wrote about his passing in her diary with a restraint that is either stoic or chilling, depending on how generously you read it. She called it the greatest mercy given his suffering. There's an argument for compassion in those words. There's also an argument for a woman who had learned, across a lifetime, to process grief through the language of propriety rather than feeling. David, the eldest, the future Edward VIII and eventual Duke of Windsor, spoke about his upbringing with a bitterness that never fully faded. The resentment festered for decades, long before the abdication crisis gave it a public stage. He felt unseen by both parents, and while George V bore his share of the blame, it was Mary's particular brand of emotional withholding that seemed to cut deepest. Perhaps because everyone expected more warmth from a mother. Perhaps because there were flickers of it, just enough to know it existed somewhere inside her, just rarely enough to make its absence sting. George V himself once admitted something startling. He said that his father, Edward VII, had been afraid of his mother, Queen Victoria, and that he himself had been afraid of his father, and he supposed his own children were afraid of him. A cycle of emotional distance passed down like an heirloom nobody wanted. Mary, whatever warmth she may have felt internally, did nothing visible to break it. She maintained the standards of the household. She insisted on protocol. She expected her children to meet the same exacting bar she set for everyone else. Love was never the question. Duty was. And duty, as she understood it, didn't require tenderness. The strange thing? She reportedly softened with her grandchildren. People who knew her in her later years described flashes of genuine humor, moments of unexpected playfulness. A woman who could be surprisingly warm when the crushing weight of the role wasn't pressing down on her every second. The young Princess Elizabeth seems to have experienced a version of her grandmother that Mary's own children rarely saw. Whether that was mellowing with age or simply the relief of a relationship without the impossible stakes of parenthood, no one can say for certain. Which raises a question you can't avoid. Was the coldness her nature, or was it armor? Forged by a 16-year-old girl watching her family's world crumble in a rented villa in Florence, armor she wore so long she forgot how to take it off. The insecurity of those early years, the knowledge that everything could be lost, might explain the rigidity as something other than cruelty. It might have been survival. A woman who couldn't afford to be soft because softness was how you ended up in exile, watching your parents pretend nothing was wrong while the creditors circled back home. Staff both feared and respected her. That combination tells you everything. She wasn't loved the way some royals manage it, through easy charm and casual warmth. She was respected the way a commanding officer is, for competence, for tirelessness, for an absolute refusal to let standards slip, and perhaps for the knowledge, visible to anyone paying attention, that she demanded more of herself than she ever demanded of anyone around her. And yet, the same woman who could freeze a room spent 60 years building something that would outlast everyone in it. Mary of Teck died on March 24, 1953, 10 weeks before Elizabeth II's coronation on June 2nd. She'd requested that the ceremony not be postponed on her account. 85 years old. Duty to the very end. What she left behind is everywhere if you know where to look. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara on the banknotes, the Vladimir tiara at state dinners, the Cullinan brooches on the sovereign's shoulder, the lover's knot catching flashbulbs at every banquet Catherine attends, the fringe tiara on 3 royal brides, the Cartier bandeau on a 4th, the Cambridge emeralds still glowing green against royal skin, over a century after Mary began the painstaking work of reassembling them. When she died, her will directed the vast majority of her personal jewelry to Elizabeth II. The effect was transformative. Elizabeth didn't just inherit a throne, she inherited a jewelry collection of extraordinary depth and coherence, assembled and curated by her grandmother over nearly 60 years. The royal jewelry collection as it functions today, the working wardrobe of tiaras and brooches and necklaces that makes the British monarchy the most visually distinctive on earth, is substantially Mary's creation. She left something harder to display in a glass case, too. A blueprint for how a queen consort could wield quiet, enormous power without ever stepping in front of the sovereign. Elizabeth II's famous devotion to duty, the conviction that the role comes before the person, that the crown matters more than whoever wears it, didn't appear from nowhere. It was taught, demonstrated, modeled by a grandmother who'd learned it the hardest way possible, as a girl who grew up knowing everything could be taken away. Understanding that Mary was difficult, cold, demanding, intimidating behind closed doors, doesn't diminish what she built. It makes it more impressive. The duty wasn't effortless, wasn't natural. It was a choice she made every single day for 60 years, despite a temperament that made warmth difficult, despite insecurities that made control feel necessary, despite a private self that her own staff described as far removed from the composed public figure the nation saw. She chose the crown, every day, and the proof is literally locked in the Tower of London. Subscribe for more stories like this.